make your rights away. So strap yourself in and let's get started.
Well, I hope everybody's doing well today. I have an interesting audio recording for you today. I think many of you will enjoy it. I'm sure the statist won't, but hey, I'm not here to please them anyways. But the reason why I've chosen this particular topic is because of how badly people misrepresent Romans chapter 13. And so I'm going to review the scripture with you. And, let us see what it actually is talking about and what scripture is actually trying to show us as it pertains to Romans 13. But, before you do that, take a look at this picture here that I've posted with my audio recording. These are authority figures in certain parts of the world. And it is typical of such authority figures that the worse they get, or the better they get, the more fearful the people are of standing for their rights and their freedom. So, in the case of Osama bin Laden and the Taliban, basically they would use a means of controlling the people. What was that mean? That means it was terrorism. It was to kill people and use fear against people. Same situation with the Third Reich and the Nazi regime. They used terrorism. They would kill people, all again under this guise of authority. And of course, we have Xi Jinping and Mr. Kim Jong-un. Again, their peoples that exist in those lands are programmed daily to accept whatever the government says that they should do. And the question is, if we read Romans chapter 13, according to the way the statist would have us read it, those people that were under those systems of authority would have to be under subjection to them. Is that what God really established and wanted? Well, certainly not. But, we'll go over Romans 13. And, ultimately we'll see what Scripture has to say. So I have Romans chapter 13. And for those wanting to know, what version or a Bible am I using, this particular is taken, I believe, from the English Standard Version, but I'm also using here the King James Version as well as other versions here, which it basically has several versions in front of me, was what I'm saying. And so this is taken from Romans 13 again. And it says, let every person be subject to the governing authority, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not the terrors to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For his is the servant of God, the avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoers. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. So it continues on and further, um, and so this is again Romans chapter 13. So, for the status, this seems pretty cut and dry. It says that you are to be in subjection to the governing authorities. Well, you know, first of all, it's important to notice that this is actually not God speaking here. This is Paul speaking here. This is a common mistake made by those that would represent this scripture to mean more than it actually does. But, it points out the proper use of authority. Going after those that are doing wrong, the bad, and as a protective means for those that are doing good. So in that sense, I can agree with that. Absolutely. An authority that is, keeping that balance is just fine. Who doesn't want to have a system that is designed to keep bad people in check? It makes sense, right? Okay. So that is what we're seeing here as being presented by Romans chapter 13. But now, what about when that authority becomes the bad? When that authority threatens the very freedoms and rights that are endowed to the people? What then? Are we still to be bound by Romans 13 to be subject to that kind of authority? Well, would you believe that the authority of terrorists has any authority over you to be free? Certainly not. Or what about, for example, just like government likes to claim territory as its own, land as its own, and basically a government is simply a group of people, that typically have some method in which it uses its authority. We all know that is by violence, and that has been the historical method that man has used to wield over other men. And so, for example, what if, as an example, there's an authority of, let's say, a gang, a gang over a certain territory. Now, do we need to be subject to the authority of a gang? Does that make any sense? I mean, hey, Romans 13 says, be in subjection to the governing authorities. Well, they're doing the same thing that government is doing. They're using violence over a certain area to hold the people that are within a specific area basically captive to their will. And that is basically what government is at this point. So, you know, what are our responsibilities, as pointed out by Romans 13? You know, well, if we look in Scripture of the varying accounts in there, there are circumstances and situations where people are able to say, enough is enough. Uh, Case in point would be when, you know, Egypt enslaved Israel. They were enslaved there for 400 years. And it came to a point where enough was enough, you know, and God decided, hey, you know what? I'm going to rescue my people out of this dictatorship to set them free. Now, when Israel actually went to Egypt, it was for the purpose of protecting their livelihood. Because at the time, when they first came into the land, there was a famine. You'll recall this situation where Joseph predicted or interpreted the dream of Pharaoh of the 7 years of famine and the 7 years of plenty. And so that's how Israel ended up in Egypt, and eventually things got turned around, and basically Egypt became a dictator to these people. And so God said, enough is enough. This dictator is treating the people badly. And so he started a means to set them free. And that's what he did. And so there is a point at which, a system of authority becomes corrupted, and it's no longer protecting the rights and the freedoms of people. But that's not an isolated situation. There's more situations in Scripture where you have authoritative figures, that are wielding authority over a certain area, and ultimately, men of God basically decide, hey, you know what, we're not going to accept that authority, we're going to resist it. Okay? Another case in point is, like, for example, we've all heard the account of David and Goliath. Well, when Israel did leave the land of Egypt, they sought out to seek out the promised land, and so what they did is ultimately they came into this land, and there were these other nations occupying this land, and they had authority over this land. Well, you know what? God, basically said, this is going to be a place where I'm going to put you, and ultimately, if you do what I tell you, I'm going to bless it to you, but if you don't, there's going to be problems. Well, there were problems, and one of those problems were the Philistines, okay? And so what ended up happening is, here comes the Philistines pushing their weight around, pushing their authority around, saying, hey, you know what, this is our land, you know what, and we're going to tell you what you can and cannot do, and basically to control these people, to do whatever they can to seize upon them, their property, and for their own benefit. But here's this young boy, basically, who says, you know what, I ain't scared of you. I've taken out a lion and a bear with my slingshot, and I'll take out your champion Goliath there. So, ultimately, their military hero Goliath gets defeated, and ultimately the people attack the Philistines and so forth. So that's just another example of, people standing up for their rights, not allowing an authoritarian system to dominate, you know, and prevent them from being free and having their rights and so forth. So it's important to understand this, that, we cannot take Romans 13 and simply assume that, every authority is pleasing to God, or is doing what God's will is. And so there is another example I wanted to share with you, actually. And this account is found at John chapter 19. And it starts, I'm actually going to start at verse 10. And it's just a couple of verses here, not too long. And basically, what the scenario here that's being discussed is how Jesus is before Pontius Pilate, and he's questioning him about all these things, that are being said against him. But here, Jesus demonstrates his exercising his right to remain silent. So Jesus already was exhibiting the Fifth Amendment before the Fifth Amendment even existed. How about that? So there you go. And so you can sense the pride and arrogance of Pilate as he's questioning him, which is often typical of those in authority. They think, "How dare you question me?" or "How dare you not acknowledge my authority?" So here in John chapter 19 verse 10, Pilate says, so Pilate said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me, the governor of Pontius Pilate?" And he says, "Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" So here's the thing. Pilate was saying, "Hey man, I have your life in my hands. I can set you free. I can let you go." That's what Pilate was saying to him. And, it's important because Jesus responds to him by saying, Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me if it were not given to you from above." Wow. So Jesus is actually confirming that the authority that Pontius Pilate has been given is coming from above. Okay, so, that is important to recognize, that there is an authority that is given to governing, but there is an important aspect to that authority. And Romans touched upon that, about, wielding that authority against those that are doing wrong and bad. Doesn't talk about wielding it against those that are not doing things wrong and bad, though. So, here Jesus responded back to him that he would have no authority unless it was given to him from above. But he points something out, because what Pontius Pilate was doing was wrong. And Jesus did make that point. He says, "Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of greater sin." So what Pontius Pilate was doing was sinful, but what those that had handed him over to Pontius Pilate had committed a greater sin than what Pilate was doing by wielding this authority in an unjust way. And so now the question is we know that, ultimately Judas was the one that sold Jesus, but it was the Jews, okay, that actually took Jesus and brought him before the Roman authority that was established at that time. And so it's important to understand that, And so, but Pilate's reaction when Jesus pointed out that what he was doing was sinful, he was, you could see the change in attitude of him by what it says in the next verse. It says, "From then on, Pilate tried to release him." Okay? He knew that what he was doing was wrong. He knew that if he judged him, that he would be doing wrong. So, Jesus gave him a little warning there as to it being sinful. But, ultimately, we know what happened. And, here Pilate tried to release him. But the Jews kept shouting, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who declares himself a king is defying Caesar." Well, here's the thing, folks. What Jesus is he had greater authority than Caesar did. So we're talking about sovereignty here, okay? And so certainly Jesus had it, And ultimately, this is a tactic that statists will do against those who choose to stand on their sovereignty. You see, here they were using the phrase, well, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Well, guess what? When they say all sorts of manner of evil against you for standing for your rights and your freedom, when they say you're mentally unsound or that you pose a threat to national security, or that you're a domestic terrorist simply for wanting to have your inalienable rights, your unenumerated natural rights, that's a problem. The government is no longer doing what is good. It is now using its authority in a bad way, in the same bad way that Pontius Pilate was doing, which was not right, which was a sin, basically. And so this is what took place. This is, how the people chose to deal with it. Those Jews that were trying to get Pilate to execute Jesus were like the statists of today. They treat us badly. They make fun of us. They don't want us to have our freedom and our rights because they live in fear. They'll use the idea that, well, if you have your rights and your freedoms, everything will be anarchy. No. Jesus wasn't teaching anarchy. He was teaching people to love each other, and to react out of love. And that was really what he was all about. But, ultimately, Jesus, he did what he did because he had to fulfill his Father's will, okay? But that didn't mean that he didn't have his sovereignty. That didn't mean just because he was in his fleshly form that he divested himself of his divinity. He did not divest himself. He had it all there. And he even said that, if, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when, they were there, when they came to get him, he acknowledged, who he was, and they were afraid, and fell back as a result of it. So, when they come to you and asking you who you are, acknowledge your sovereignty. Don't deny it. You have sovereignty. That is God. That is given to you by God. Okay, it's part of your nature, and so don't allow the fear that governs their mentality to come over you, because that's what they use. They use fear, and that's why whenever men try to wield authority over other men, they use fear, or they'll use a means to prevent people from being free. Nowadays, we know that comes in the form of varying tools that they use, like a gun, to wield their authority, handcuffs, tasers, so forth. But you know what? At the end of the day, they're going to stand before God too. You see, that's what they don't seem to understand, is that if they're using their authority in a bad way, they're going to answer for it too. But here's the deal, folks. What the statists don't realize about authority, especially here on Earth, is that, when it comes to the governments, when it comes to the kingdoms of this earth, the reason why they're allowed to do what they're doing is because of the ruler of this world, okay? So we know that the ruler of this world is Satan, okay? And basically, it was allowed for Satan to have this authority as a result of the decisions that were made. And so, how can I prove this? How can I, show that this is indeed the case? Well, we know that this is the case because in Luke it tells us. Luke chapter 4, starting with verse 6. Well, I guess you can start at verse 5, where this is where Jesus is being tempted by the devil. And basically the devil says, just do one act of worship to me and I'll give you all these kingdoms. Well, guess what, folks? The devil could offer to Jesus something that he didn't have. Okay? So he had that authority. So what it says is, in verse 5, it says, the devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. Okay? All the kingdoms, I will give you the authority over these kingdoms and all their glory, he said, for it has been relinquished to me, and I can give it up to anyone I wish. So now, here's where the crux comes in, folks. And for those of you who actually listen to the video all the way, or this recording all the way to this point, this is where it starts to get juicy. See, the world, the kingdoms of this world, the governments of this world are under demonic authority. And that is why they are doing what they're doing in a bad way. They're not really seeking to help people. They're acting like dictators. If you look at the far majority of governmental systems, they act like dictatorships. They limit the rights and freedoms of people, and ultimately they wield their authority by threatening the lives of people. That's what they do. And so, certainly, this image before you is a correct one to demonstrate the demonic, satanic reality of these kingdoms. And so, it's important in understanding this in order for you to understand what Romans is actually talking about. And so, again, he says, I will give you authority over all these kingdoms and all their glory. He said, for it has been relinquished to me. So, I don't really fully understand why God just didn't simply, get rid of the devil way back then and just, you know, restart things all over. But for whatever reason God chose, he chose to allow things to go the way they are. Could be for the purpose of allowing man to fully live out their freedom, even if that freedom was, not in agreement with his will. But ultimately, he allows Satan to be the ruler of this world, and Satan relinquishes that authority to whomever he wishes. So Xi Jinping, he wishes to relinquish authority to him. He has. Kim Jong-un or Osama bin Laden or Adolf Hitler. Listen, these are examples, of authorities. Now, under the statist mindset, according to their way of interpreting Romans, you would have to be under that authority. Okay? But that's obviously not the case. And so we have examples in Scripture of where people are able to reject authority. And, while I'm at it, there's another authority that exists. It's church authority. For many, many years, the Catholic Church dominated the world with, their version of what they call Christianity, if you will. But, of course, we know that many of the things that they do is incorrect and not in agreement with Scripture and not in agreement with the will of God. And so, for example, we have individuals like Martin Luther who questioned and was not being submissive to the authority of the church. So, clearly, we have examples, whether it's Martin Luther, whether it was, the people setting themselves free from the Egyptian authority, whether it was David, facing off with the Philistines, and whether it was the founding fathers. The founding fathers, ultimately, they rejected the authority of the King of England. So what does that make them? Well, according to the status today, they would say, hey, these must be sovereign citizens. Hello. Come on. It's ridiculous. But nonetheless, this is the mentality of statists and those people that live in fear, that, ultimately they want to take away everybody else's freedoms and rights just so that they can have this type of protection that ultimately further and further is dominating and eventually becomes a dictatorship. So that's what it is. So in the case of all these situations, whether it be the founding fathers, whether it's David, whether it was the Israelites, or whether, whatever, or Martin Luther, these are all situations where people did not simply accept the authority, they rejected it, and we have every right to reject the authority of this government. Because when this government made a choice to exceed the limits of the Constitution, which it has. It has made varying justifications as to why it has, but ultimately it has violated the Constitution. Not that the Constitution is something that we are bound by, but rather that it was a system established for this government to exist, and a contract where it would stay within these limitations. It has exceeded those limitations, and therefore the founding fathers recognized that it was important to establish that, if the government becomes, like that dictatorship, that we have the right to reject it. We have the right to abolish it. We have that right, not because the government gave it to us, but because God gave it to us. And that right, if we exercise it in a good way, when we face God and He judges us for exercising that authority, then ultimately we will prevail and God will see that we do well. So really, what God's authority that He was seeking to establish was the kind of authority that was good and protective. The authority that is bad is the kind that, is the kind that is being relinquished to the devil, and ultimately he shares that with evil men. And so that's basically what it is, folks. It's understanding what Scripture is actually talking about. Because in the final analysis, there's a scripture in Daniel that talks about God setting up His own kingdom and would bring to destruction all these other kingdoms, and ultimately His kingdom would reign forever. And so that shows you, if God wanted these kingdoms, He'd keep them around, right? Obviously, that's not the case. So, understanding, interpreting Scripture on this particular issue is very important. And unfortunately to say, far too many people out there have been deceived. Even people who are believers who have taken, this Scripture and just basically used it as a means to be lazy in their, dealing with a government that has exceeded its limitations. They just want to accept, oh, well, we have to be in subjection, so whatever the government says, we got to follow. That's complete nonsense. That is exactly how the Chinese people have their system the way they have it, how the North Koreans have their system the way they have it, and how these other systems that existed, whether it was the Third Reich or whether it was the Taliban, they all establish themselves by having that means. And the only way we can keep this system from becoming that way is to resist it, in when it's doing what is bad. And so that is a balanced view and understanding of Romans 13. Anyone who says otherwise, they're just trying to spin something off in a way that is not taking Scripture in context of the entire Scripture. They're just trying to cherry pick what they want out of the Bible. And so that's what it boils down to. So, folks, please, I really appreciate you. Thank you for listening in. Please like and share this. And may God bless you. And keep standing for your freedoms. All right? All right. Well, take care. Talk to you later.